Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is sheathed in so many layers of turbulent change, it's hard to keep track. Um, there's a big one these days in the geopolitical realm, along with the Ukraine war. President Trump has initiated what's called a war of choice in the Middle East. That by many accounts is backfiring in big ways, not just politically, but in terms of how the world works. I'm showing here right now this is not live, but this is from this morning via uh, I'll show the Twitter account in a minute, a company that keeps track of ship movements. And it's like a blocked artery, literally. The Strait of Hormuz is now newly appreciated, I think, by most people, is not just as a conduit for oil, but also for natural gas and for helium and for fertilizer and for lots of the basic underpinnings of how the world works. You might recall a few years ago, the Suez Canal had a shutdown that jolted everyone into thinking about supply chains more carefully. Now we have this one, and the reverberations are flowing forward. I'm really glad this morning, noontime, Eastern time, to have Janet Ginsburg, who goes by J.A. Ginsburg in print, who's dug in deeply on materials, the material world. I think you're working on a book. Your Substack is a must read on this stuff. I'll show the Substack link there. And we're going to talk about the ramifications of what is unfolding. And there's is good news the right way to say it? There are implications here for changing how the world works going forward that make us much less reliant on choke points like this and on fossil fuels. So Janet, it's good to connect with you. We've never met face to face, but we've been in touch for many, many years through the SciFu network and elsewhere. Quick question first: what got you focused on this? You've ranged very widely in how you approach the world and how you communicate. So, maybe a quick sketch of what.
Well, a couple of years ago, I found myself uncomfortable in pretty much every room. So the people who don't believe in climate change, the denialists, I was never in that room. But from covering energy, from covering all sorts of things, you would think I would be in the net zero camp. And I found myself frustrated with them because it was sort of a reductionist approach to a problem. And for all of the urgency that you would hear about this at COPs, it was even if they got what they wanted, it was never going to achieve what they wanted. That there was too much environmental degradation everywhere. And likewise, you would think that I would be like all happy about circularity and less waste. I think is absolutely wonderful. That is table stakes. But we live on a planet with declining resources, and in some cases, resources that are harder and harder to get. So if you talk to people in metals, they'll talk about a copper famine. There are 60 minerals on the USGS critical minerals list. It's not just oil and gas we're talking about. And water is a fresh water, which is used for everything. So that's drinking and agriculture and mining and manufacturing and cooling data centers. That is actually a declining resource because aquifers are being depleted. Glaciers are melting. Things that were terrestrial water are turning into water vapor and feeding aerial rivers. So we've kinked that. And we have a growing population. So there was no version where you can reduce and reuse and recycle your way to the future.
Right.
We have more people who are going to need more of everything. So I was really, kind of beside myself that, how do you get through this? How does this get better? And I stumbled onto a story that I ended up writing about that was a collaboration between a chemical company called Lancetech that happens to be headquartered a 20-minute walk from where I live. So I've been aware of them forever. And their trick is they started in New Zealand. they found a microbe, a naturally occurring microbe that was in a microbe library. I think they found it in that occurs in the gut of a rabbit. So unlikely, but there you go. That likes to eat carbon and poops out ethanol. And that was a pretty good trick. And they spent 20 years torquing this up in every which way imaginable. So you could get really good quantities of ethanol. And On, the running shoe company, was started by triathletes, and they're outdoors a lot, and they care a lot about the environment because they can see all the glaciers in Switzerland, which is where they're based, all melting. They can see everything going to pieces. So they wanted to try to create a fossil-free EVA shoe. So EVA is a kind of plastic, very common, used in every running shoe you see. This would not solve the problem of plastics, but it would divert the need to have a fossil feedstock. So they collaborated on this, and they actually came up with this. They figured out how to take that ethanol and turn it into ethylene and turn it into EVA. In the meantime, what sort of turned my head with this was that On added a business model to it. So they did a shoe as a service idea where you would spend $30 a month and you'd get to use the shoes, and when the shoes wore out, you get another pair. They did this with some mono-material shoe made of castor beans. So it was just a pilot, but it ran for quite a while. And it upped their recycle rates from less than 10%, which is typical, to north of 80%, which was outrageous. I would have been impressed at 30%. The show-off chemists at LanzaTech turned the spent microbes into high-protein cattle feed. Now, I should also point out that the ethanol that they were creating, because this is biology, had to be low heat or you'd kill the bugs. So it was also low heat, so it meant it was low emission. So it was qualitatively better than corn ethanol or sugarcane ethanol. So you had all these circles and all of these net zeros all woven tightly together, and they were coming up with a polyanswer that was altogether better. Now, taking this idea and actually scaling up a supply chain of this kind of EVA, that's a whole other hurdle. But they proved that something was possible. So I began looking and just gathering stories across every sector. Were there other companies that were doing this sort of thing? Was I onto something here? And I was absolutely amazed that every sector I looked at, whether it was construction or packaging or textiles or metallurgy or agriculture or whatever, had examples of this. So I began to sort of look at this and say, are we in a materials transition that nobody has really named as such yet?
Right. And you've been writing about it regularly on Substack too. And I think your answer is, well, it's kind of like the energy transition, where for a long time that phrase got thrown around. And what's true mostly for energy so far is it's mostly addition, not transition. But here, I think there is a possibility of transition where you're not just adding more. The issue with energy is it's fossil stuff, and then you add a layer of wind and a layer of solar and a layer of biofuel on that, but you're not you have so much need for energy that it's still basically a fossil system.
What I ended up sort of figuring out was that these two things, there was a yin to the yang. Now, the term materials transition has been out there. The World Economic Forum, had papers about it, but what they were really referring to were only the materials that you needed to actually build out the energy transition. They forgot about the rest of everything.
Right.
And even the companies, and I've interviewed at this point dozens of them, they may know that they're being pioneers in plastic or in textiles or in whatever it is. They don't necessarily see themselves as part of a larger movement, that they are the ones who are literally figuring out how to build the future. And once they sort of get that idea, they get extremely happy about it. It kind of gives them a larger purpose.
Yeah. And how much we were going to be speaking this morning, he had to pull out with the CEO of Solugen, which is a company with a sort of biologically based.
They're wonderful. They're quite wonderful. And Interestingly enough, very early on, I kind of got onto them and found their story and I have yet to interview them. I was really looking forward to meeting him today, but I will get there. I will get there. So what they do, and it's so clever. They use they combine biology and chemistry, and honestly, the lines between the two are a little bit wiggly because there is no biology without chemistry, but
Right.
whatever. And what they figured out how to do was to use an enzymatic catalyst as the first step in producing industrial chemicals. And then they can they can pair it with a traditional metal catalyst, and it's much more effective. They're using corn syrup as their feedstock rather than petroleum. And what that is, it's providing, if I've got this right, and I think I do, it's providing the sugars, the raw material that the enzymatic catalysts can begin to react to.
Right.
And the combination of using biology and chemistry this way makes their process like 96% efficient versus a traditional petrochemical that's about 60% efficient. And that gives them all sorts of advantages that kind of cascade in the size of the plant they need, the amount of material that they can make at a given time. It lends itself to distributed manufacturing, which means that they have shorter supply chains. So it is sort of a cascade of goodness.
Right. And that kind of takes us back to the Strait of Hormuz because, well, when this was unfolding, I became familiar with the company through Twitter, and through Gaurav Chakrabarti, the CEO, made this point about how the closure of the strait was really juicing up interest in his business in a hurry.
Yeah.
Because a big chunk of the idea is that you can decentralize. You can cut away the idea of these kind of global supply chains and do more of your work at home if you have the right feedstocks. Here he said the Strait of Hormuz has been closed for 8 days. Everyone thinks this is about oil. It's about what oil becomes. 92% of the world's sulfur comes from refining oil and gas. As we've heard elsewhere, helium, a third of the world's helium, which is critical for medical imaging as well as chip manufacturing, comes from this region.
That's so
it's like a spur to the possibilities that you've just been talking about.
So he brings out sulfur, and that's a really interesting one because that has two uses that have cascades. So one area where it's used a lot is in mining. So you use sulfur to kind of loosen up the rock, essentially, and liberate kind of the dregs that you couldn't get just by hacking it out there. So it's really critical. And so if we're talking about all of those metals that are needed for the energy transition, that's a choke point right there, because that's going to cut down on the productivity of mining. Sulfur is also a critical material for vulcanization of rubber. And where that gets kind of critical is that, so there is a lot of synthetic rubber, and that's made out of petrochemicals. Natural rubber, which comes from a tree, is the only material that anybody has found that you can land a plane on. So every plane that you're on has natural rubber tires because they can handle the cold that's way up high, and they can handle the heat of landing on the runway, and they can carry the weight of the plane. So if you don't have sulfur, you start to have supply shocks that go into rubber. And before you know it, you can have a supply shock that is going to affect transportation. So, yeah.
All these little threads that extend outward that people don't think about until something hits the fan. And we've had that in a big way right now. So as you kind of made the rounds of these companies, let's talk about defense, because you were saying earlier, and it's pretty clear that Solugen, among others, has become a bit of a darling again because of supply issues in the defense arena. It's not just
logistics is everything. It is just everything. And Uh, if you have a battle like we're having right now, and all the normal ports where you would refuel and you would do whatever you were doing are on the other side of the Strait of Hormuz, then that means you have to have long supply chain, ships and trucks and everybody else to get you what you need. And one of the advantages a number of these companies I've been looking at, and I know that Solugen is looking at this too, is creating almost like a mini lab in a shipping container. I'm convinced that the shipping container is the building form of the 21st century. Everybody can put something in a shipping container. And it allows them to manufacture the chemicals that they need for instance, cleaning out pipes, which get scale. And I mean, like we use chemicals in so many different ways that we don't normally think about, but they make our life literally work. And, if you are trying to run a complicated operation like that, you need those chemicals. So their ability to have distributed manufacturing is turning out to be a huge plus. But, when I started going around to this, so, the variety of companies has amazed me. And one of the things I did in that Substack post was look at a car and try to figure out, if I just looked at the outside of a car, how many materials, how many companies I know that would make a difference. So from the outside, that car might look the same, but what would it look like if it had been put through the materials transition?
Right.
So I started with a sodium ion battery. And BYD is already starting to put these in cars. CATL is making them. BYD is also doing sulfide solid state batteries. The key thing here is that they're not lithium. They don't explode. And if you happen to be a sodium ion battery, you're made out of relatively cheap materials as well. So you're reducing costs and you're reducing your supply chain. So that's lovely. There is a company that is based, I believe, in Chile and also Germany called Strongbyform. And they're one of many companies that are doing sort of a high-end manufactured plywood, the kind of thing that Charles and Ray Eames would like be beside themselves if they were around today to look at this. And what they do, this is a biomimic. So they looked at a tree, and what a tree does when it grows more wood where it needs the strength. So using AI and computer vision and God knows what else, they can layer on strips of wood where it needs to be stronger. So that's the name Strongbyform. And they actually did a project with BMW looking at car bodies. Could you replace steel? And you could. Now, again, that was just a prototype. Not all these ideas are commercial at scale, but let's say we have a wooden car. So that's kind of fun. And then the next thing we're going to do is we've got to go inside the car. And I happen to know that BYD has already been looking at this, of changing out leather seats or fabric seats with mycelial leather seats. So this is made of mushrooms.
Right.
Okay. It takes a fraction of the time to make this stuff. It takes a fraction of the water. You don't have to buy a cow. You don't have to raise a cow. You don't have to feed a cow. You don't have to slaughter the cow. And you get the leather. So we're going to have mycelial leather. That's going to have a much better footprint. We're going to look at all of the things like the dashboard and all the things that are kind of plastic, and there's usually foam behind it. And there's a company there in North Carolina called Simplyfiber. And they have been experimenting with using cellulosic material to do injection molding. And they are currently working on a project with Kia to do those kinds of parts. And one of the really fun things about it is that because they're doing an injection mold, very much like Strongbyform, they can control where it needs to be thick or thin. So it's conceivable that you could use this cellulosic injection molding and replace the foam and the plastic. And because it's cellulose, which is essentially from a tree, you could source your key materials locally. So this starts to get fun. So we've really done nice things with the interior of the car. So we're going to look under the engine now. And in an engine, you have motors, and in the motors, there are these permanent magnets. And those permanent magnets are the things that have all those rare earths in them. There is a company in Minnesota called Niron, and they have figured out how to make iron nitride batteries. This is something that has been in sort of the research pipeline probably for 30 years. And they are really ready to scale this up. It has all kinds of applications, including eventually inside motors, inside cars. Now, what's wonderful about this is that you don't need those rare earths, which are just horrendous, both to try to mine and to refine. They're really messy. You're using iron, which is plentiful. We got lots of it. And you're using a nitride, so you're using nitrogen. Again, plentiful. So it's kind of like the sodium ion battery. Somehow or other, all of these things that are in the headlines now, will we hit a point in a few years where we don't need them? Maybe.
Right.
We're also going to look at the other part of a permanent magnet is what they call it's high quality iron. Very few impurities. Right now, all of the high quality iron we get is imported from China. So none of it is made here. There is a startup that is absolutely wonderful. They're based in Houston called Hertha Metals. And they're named after Hertha Ayrton, who was a woman scientist in the 1800s in England, who was a pioneer in arc, figuring out like arc reactors. And they use an electric arc reactor to actually make this stuff. So if the arc reactor is powered by green energy, there's no emissions from making steel this way. They have a way of making steel that does not use any fossil anything. So, as I said, if you wanted to have clean energy power the arc furnace, you're there. But instead of using metallurgical coal, which is a whole mess to make and very expensive, they can use either natural gas or hydrogen. And if they use natural gas, the way the process works, it actually takes the hydrogen out of the natural gas, and that's the reactive agent. They can do this in one step. They've managed to take it from bench scale to 1 ton a day, and now they're in the midst of building their demonstration plant. And the product that they're going to be producing in their demonstration plant is this high quality iron.
Fascinating.
So they don't have to go all the way to steel here. They can just do that. It commands a premium price, and there is no other domestic manufacturer. So there's lots of brilliance going on here in figuring out how, if you're a startup in an industry where China makes like 1 billion tons of steel a year and can flood the market and can reduce prices, which is why we really only have one steel mill in the US anymore. This is a way a little startup can get, a toehold in a really big, tough industry. So now we have really clean permanent magnets. We're thrilled. And we're going to go look at the tires. And there is a company. It turns out that EVs, because they're heavier, wear through tires really fast. Like every 15,000 miles, you got to get new tires. And tires are usually, they're a mix of natural rubber and synthetic rubber and lots of additives. Some of those additives are truly terrible. And because they are on the road and they're creating all of these, it's microplastics essentially, and a lot of them. So there's this company called Enso, and they figured out how to make a better tire specifically for electric cars. So they will last longer, they improve performance, and they don't produce as many microplastics. So now you can sit back and look at this car that on the outside might look identical to every other car you've looked at, and it's completely different.
Right. And what you're talking about, these substitution phenomena always seem to come up. Well, let me back up. In the press, we jump on the bottlenecks, and we write about. I can't tell you how many examples. Well, batteries for sure, just a few years ago, critical minerals, we're going to mine the seabed and the like, and some of that's still going to happen for sure, but these substitutions happen faster. Not always, but they certainly seem to happen more rapidly these days, for sure, than we might have seen decades past.
Well, one of the things that I've seen, and you really are touching on an important point here, is that with many of these companies that are now really coming to commercial scale so that they make a difference, they are building on research that goes back 10,
Right.
20, 30 years. A lot of it came from national labs,
Right.
often the national labs working with universities. And Doge did a number on the innovation pipeline here in the US. Now, big picture in the world, whatever we've dropped, Europe and China have picked right up. And
That's for
Canada
sure.
has done a really lovely job with taking advantage of just importing talent. So in the big picture, the ideas that were the pipeline is okay, but the pipeline in the US was damaged in a way that we're going to see a very long shadow for a long time.
Yeah, I'm afraid you're right. Well, I'm not afraid you're right. I know you're right. John Drake, who's a scientist at University of Georgia, did a really good piece. I'm going to try to have him on my show soon about Trump firing the National Science Board, the advisors for the NSF, the entire board, and I'm sure he'll fill them up with people like who are on his Kennedy Center. Oh, I mean Trump Center. And but what I think your point is so important about the long tail. The same thing with USAID, et cetera, where the damage has been done so quickly, could reverberate for a very long time.
But what I am seeing, and this is a fun thing to see, when Trump came in, when I started looking at materials, it was a completely different story. I was all impressed with how green everybody was. Climate change was the lead in every pitch deck, and it was somehow gentler, like it was going to move forward in this very positive way. And when Trump came in, I immediately started expanding my research to be more international. And I found all sorts of wonderful companies doing wonderful things. There's one resource that people who are interested in materials ought to know about that they may not know about here. They call themselves TOCCO, but it's spelled TOCCO. It is a materials consultancy based in Paris with a big footprint in Asia. And they make the prettiest reports you ever did see. And they've covered a lot of things. I began using them as a tip sheet, and we began, I'd compliment them on LinkedIn, and they would follow me, and we've actually gotten to be friends. But truly, just because they are based in Europe and Asia, their point of perspective was so different. So here we tend to think, well, we have all the best ideas and, anything interesting is coming out of here. And it so isn't the case. So like I said, I've used them as a tip sheet. And one of my favorite companies is a company called Shellworks, and they're based in the UK. And part of the reason they're a favorite company is that the founders met while they were doing a dual degree in art and technology. I think the Imperial College of Art and the Imperial College of something else. And they were given an assignment to tackle a big problem. So they thought that they were going to tackle plastic, and they figured out how to make a plastic from lobster shells. So they called themselves Shellworks. It was a flop, did not work. Just terrible, but really interesting people. They kept going at this. And what they now have, they just raised $15 million, which I think is on top of more money that they've had, and they're having a good day. They have figured out how to make a bottle that is shelf stable, food grade, dishwasher safe, what they call deformable, so you can poke it. They even have a dropper bottle made out of this stuff, and it is home compostable. And what they figured out how to do, so when you look at most bioplastics, you'll have biomass, and then they'll add microbes to break down the biomass, and then take that biomass and do a few things and turn it into a plastic. There are good things that can happen with that, also not so good things. You can have a profile that is very identical to a petrochemical plastic with sort of microplastics and a bad end of life.
Mm-hmm.
They went the other way. They took biomass as a feast to feed microbes. And then what they're harvesting are the microbial polymers, so the microbial plastics, the natural plastics. And they're using that as the core of their material that they call Vivomir.
What's it called again?
It's called Vivomir, Vivomer. I think life of the sea, probably. And so you have just 3 ingredients, basically. You've got biomass, water, and microbes. And they even have formulations where you could do this with salt water. And one of their customers is a health and beauty company that was just bought by, and I forget which big conglomerate, but one of the big ones. And given all of this shortage with the Strait of Hormuz, what you're now starting to see, I saw a story, it's really, actually, these stories are popping up all over the place, about shortages in resins for plastic packaging. Right. Well, here's another way to do a plastic package.
Right. Yeah. So again, stresses on systems spur innovation and make companies that might be on a margin, suddenly it changes their prospects.
That's exactly right. And, Bill Gates had this term that I've always been annoyed by, of the green premium. And it's because it's only focused on, we're going to measure carbon, when you really need to measure how much water does it take, how much land does it take, what is the distribution of it. And so Amory Lovins, we're both friends, you know him well. And way back when I was at Business Week, I read Natural Capitalism and loved it, and managed to talk my editor into sending me out to RMI and NREL. And Amory taught me all the right questions to ask about energy. So I learned from the master right away. And one of the things that he would talk about was this idea of a negawatt. And that came out of a typo. A friend of his was reading a magazine article, and
megawatt. I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. Megawatt was a typo. It was written as negawatt, and Amory was deeply amused by that. So he used that to mean all of the benefits that cascade from energy efficiency. As I got going with materials, I thought, I'm going to take this idea one step further, and I'm going to create negamats. And so all the benefits, that come from using a different material, a material in a different way, using a different process, adding a different business model, so that you can really begin to quantify that you're not just going for price parity. I have a bag and it's going to be the exact same cost as this bag, but you actually really understand all the other values that it brings to the table. So right now, a number of companies I've been talking to talk about customers who are now appreciating the just in case value versus the just in time value. Because, between tariffs and everything else, the cost of something, they would always go after where is it the cheapest place to make it, and shipping is negligible, so we won't even worry about that. Now shipping is everything, and tariffs have really changed things. So, they're appreciating the value of this. So a company that where that really comes in, there's a company called Plant D. They're based in North Carolina, and they were started by some SpaceX people. And what they wanted to do, they decided they were worried more about Planet A than Planet B. They wanted to do something that would take as much carbon out of the atmosphere as possible. And they went at this in a very methodical engineering kind of way. What would be the product? What would be the industry? What would we do? And what they came up with was a way to make those 4x8 boards that you see like every time there's construction on a house. You know, you see those boards out there.
Sure.
Those are called strand board, and they're made out of lumber that is usually from Canada, and there's a whole process of you have to take the tree down and get the water out of the tree and squish it all together, and it's a big plant, and it's a lot of heat, and it's a lot of pressure. These guys figured out how to grow a perennial grass that they can harvest 3 times a year, and they had to re-engineer all of the machinery to be able to handle this. The nature of it is that it is inherently a little bit more fireproof and more water resistant. So it's actually a better product. And D.H. Horton, I think that's their name. It's like the largest home builder in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Has a huge offtake with them. And the other day they just announced a partnership with a furniture builder. So this is a real product that can scale and that is making money. And it is because it's made out of this grass and they don't have to take down a tree, the tree can stay in the forest.
Right.
There's another company, and then I'll shut up for a while.
No, this is
well, I love these companies. I mean, I think
you're making an important point here just by listing all of them.
Well, part of what's been so much fun, just a real gift for me, and you know this as a journalist, you get to go out there and call people that you have no business calling and find out what they do. I can't think of anything I can't think of a better job. So Ruby was one that I talked to. This is such an interesting company. Ruby is short for, I think, Rubinesco, which sounds like an Italian salad, but it's actually an enzyme that is critical for basically all of life. Like it's a big thing for plants. And what they do, they like Solugen, they're using an enzymatic process. So you don't have to have a vat and with a bioreactor and try to figure out how to raise cells. You're just going after the enzymes. And an enzyme is a biocatalyst. So it's a little clump of molecules that are really good at getting something to happen. And then they can do it repeatedly and reliably. And what they decided to do is to use it to take CO2 and turn it into lyocell. And lyocell is a fiber that is traditionally made from trees, from cellulose. They can, so what the tree is doing is the tree is taking in CO2 and in all of its little processes, turning it into wood. And then we go with that next step and turn the wood, which is cellulose, into a product that we can turn into a fiber. They skip that. So very much like plant D, you don't have to, or the mycelial leather. You don't have to plant the tree. You don't have to wait for the tree to grow. You don't have to worry about the forest fire. You don't have to, none of that.
Right.
You go straight from CO2 and water with these enzymes into this fiber called lyocell, which can be spun into a yarn and turned into a fabric. They recently announced they'd raised another $7.5 million. But the coolest thing is that they have $60 million in offtake agreements with major brands and manufacturers. And very much like Solugen, they can set up a plant in a little shipping container. So part of what they're doing as they go out into the world is to have the shipping container. They will offer, let's say, a yarn spinner. You can have one of these in your factory. You can make as much of this fiber whenever you want, however you want it. We will license this to you. That megawatt means you don't have to ship it in. You don't have to worry whether there's enough room on a ship and a train and a here and a there. You can make what you need as your raw material. Right. And you're working with CO2, which you'd have to get from somewhere, but there are lots of places you can get it, and water, and you're off to the races.
Right.
There's another company called Unspun, and they're just, it's so damn clever. They figured out how to do 3D weaving. So you can go from a yarn, and it's this madly complex thing, but it works. And you could weave a pair of pants without having to make fabric, without having to cut the fabric, without having the fabric waste. And basically, you can from the yarn to the garment is a direct thing, and you might have to put in a zipper or a button, but you have an almost finished garment.
That's remarkable.
Which is, I mean, it's wild. Back to On, because I love them. The On guys are so creative. They're wild. I mean, they have a lot of fun in Switzerland. So a few years ago, there was a design student who saw somebody making a Halloween like spider web using a spray gun, and it inspired him to do his college project. He was going to do a spray-on shoe, and somebody from On saw this and said, "Hire the kid," and it went through 6 years of R&D. But they're light spray shoe, and they now just built a new factory in South Korea to make these. So this is a big deal. This is at scale. This is there. It is done with a robotic arm, one of those arms that has way too many joints, and it just sprays on the plastic, and it uses a fraction of the material. They figured out how to make a shoe that has exactly 8 parts. Most shoes have 20 some parts. So it's much simpler to make. Because it is made by a robotic arm, because this is how it is. If they wanted to, they could set up a factory here in the US and bypass tariffs.
Right.
Which is another negawatt in how this whole thing kind of comes together. So in so many different ways, there are, it's hard not to just share there's just so many of these damn things. There's a company that came spinning out of Northwestern and is literally within walking distance of me. And they're called Azul 3D. And they figured out how to do, how to control light so that when you're doing 3D printing and it's a thermoset so that you're setting it with light, they can do it at a very, very fine degree. So this is the kind of 3D printing that comes rising up out of the ooze rather than the little circles that look like Play-Doh.
Interesting.
They specialize in optics. Now, you wear glasses, right?
I do.
Okay, so your glasses probably started out as resin. They're probably plastic because nobody makes them out of glass anymore. Probably a resin, possibly from a company in New Jersey. That is all sent. Once the resin's made, it is turned into, what do they call it? A puck. Is it a puck? It's a something. It is sent to China. Now, the way the glasses go is, you have concave and convex. And at the factory in China, they will make these pucks that have a million different slight gradations of the convex part, because it's the concave part that will actually get ground down. So they make these pucks, which are like, 80 grams or heavy.
Mm-hmm.
They pack them all up and they send them back to the United States. And the place where your glasses will get ground has to carry a ridiculous number of SKUs to have the right pucks for the right prescriptions, for the right everything. This is nuts. You have all of this back and forth, and it is just completely ridiculous. They can make the glasses using their 3D printers, the exact size, the exact amount of plastic, no waste, no travel.
Wow.
So this is how, in all of these ways that we don't see, this is how it gets better. So colors and coatings are another whole area. Everything you look at around you has at least one color and coating, right? It's like skin. It turns out to be the biggest category of all of them. There are companies, one I particularly liked was called Colorifics, and they're based, I believe, in the UK. And were interested. It was by a couple of people who were actually using dye to look at water quality. And I think they were in Indonesia. They were somewhere where textile waste was a real problem. And they sort of learned about it that way. And they thought, well, if we're using color like this, what could we do? Is there a better chemistry for making the dye? How do we do this? So they figured out you can look at anything in nature and find the DNA for whatever color it made. So if a leaf is a certain green or whatever it is, you can find the DNA of it. They grow microbes. They do a little bit of microbial magic. The microbes express the color. The dye is in the microbe. It is biodegradable. It doesn't hurt the environment. And it's real. It's happening.
That's wild. Well, that's a great kind of introduction to this materials trends revolution, I guess. That is a core part of what you're doing on your Substack. And here's just a few of your recent posts that are relevant. I think we're going to have to do a follow-up just to kind of dig in further. What I do want to do is get you on with a couple of the innovators here. That would be fun.
Oh, I am so delighted to finally meet you. I mean, so for the people who don't know, so there's this group called SciFu, which grew out of a conference that is just a really delicious conference. It's a marvelous group of people. It is mostly scientists. So you and I are really lucky to be in that list. And
I couldn't agree more.
And I've, certainly seen your post, read your post, known you. I feel like we're old friends that just met.
Yeah, well, virtual connectivity still matters. I love actual face-to-face stuff too, and those SciFu meetings they were in person. And there's a Wikipedia page now. I think I ever brought my guitar, unfortunately. So
well, that brings up an important point, because you have a new album coming out.
I do, and it's coming out Thursday. And actually, speaking of materials, I wasn't going to make a physical CD, but an old-time folk musician who's on a lot of radio shows says many DJs still like to have a physical thing in their hand. So spent yesterday sending them around. Here it is. Wake Me Up, Martha.
That is pretty marvelous. So I was listening to you'd given a concert in Ithaca, within the last week, and it was up on YouTube. So it was
that one in Ithaca. That was actually a number of years ago. But
was it?
Yeah, I found the old recording and posted it. But I do this off and on.
But truly, it was like discovering that somebody that you've known in one. Well, it is exactly like that. Someone you've known in one area turns out to have this incredible other life. And I know you had on your website for this that you were going to be touring around. So if you ever come anywhere near Chicago,
oh yeah,
you're going to let me know, right?
Well, we can work on that. Yes, I do what's called a singing journalist presentations that are kind of fun, where I sing and talk. Journalism and music have this ancient interrelationship. The broadside ballads that started in England in like the year 1500, Shakespeare's time, used to be sung news. It was, and there have been many cases where I was in Washington, D.C. in the early aughts on assignment for the Times, and heard on the Metro, this family got on at the Arlington National Cemetery, stopped, and they'd come from a funeral of a veteran, and they said that the preacher officiating had mentioned the cemetery is running out of room. And at first I thought of doing an article about that, but then the Baltimore Sun had actually done a good article about it. So I wrote a song called basically the key phrase is, where will they go when there's no more room in Arlington? And that was on my first album that came out in 2013. So the process of writing songs often it's not always the case. Joni Mitchell's songs are very different. But for me, the storytelling ones are just like very journalistic in a
Well,
way.
one of the things I've found, which is so marvelous about the SciFu group, is just how multi-talented people are. So Meg Lauman, who I only know through SciFu, we've never met. This is a marvelous scientist and an expert in the world's treetops.
Right.
And I read her biography, her autobiography, and I had written something about, I get through these very strange times. Everybody has rituals. I start the day. I've got a journal. I have to write down 3 things that make me happy, at least 3 things.
I like that.
Happy, not gratitude, happy. It can be, the flowers on my windows. It can be anything, but happy.
Right.
And then there's a book called Atlas Obscura Wildlife, I think it is. And it's one of the Atlas Obscura books are fun. And I'll pick a random 2 pages and I'll read something about nature that will blow my mind. And I'll think, that happened. That's real. And I wrote something about this on the Substack, and I put it on the SciFu thing. And Meg decided to send me her new little book called Tree Day. And it was so delicious. It's about 24 different trees, and it's a small, physically small book. And I knew I could read it in one bite, but I didn't want to read it in one bite. I spent 3 weeks reading it, like 1 chapter every day, and then wrote about it. And the amount of resourcefulness. This is a woman who is a poor, broke graduate student, found herself in the Australian rainforest, 150 feet from what she wanted to study, in the wrong direction, with an old car, no assistant, no nothing. And she figured out one way or another, I guess there were some other students who liked to mountain climb. She shot an arrow with a rope around it and ratcheted herself up and discovered a new world, and then shared it with the world. And so the people who are in this group, one after another, just sort of blow me away. So to listen to you as I was walking around the block yesterday was another one of those. I love this group.
Well, I do too, and I'm glad there's still the listserv. There's a question that just came in, the first question here. Scott Murray, let's see, for new materials competing with fossil fuel or lumber, what will allow them to compete with the economies of scale, pricing power, and predatory business practices of the big companies? So that last point is particularly important.
It's a big one. There's a few different things, part of which is, okay, so right now we're seeing Trump's carbon tax, since he likes to name things after himself. I'm naming this after him. Jumpstarting the energy transition. Everybody wants an EV, so this is all going well. What we're seeing now, what's being exposed now, is just how absolutely nuts global trade is. It is based on fat ships, thin straits, and just-in-time inventory that is got supply shocks happening in every which direction. So part of where these guys are competing is in offering value that the fossil doesn't have. When you talk about the lumber one, so it depends where you're getting the lumber. So for Plant D, their value add is that there's no tariff and that they can actually supply a product predictably, and it will be within a certain price. Right. So, prices may go up because, supply, demand, who knows what, but they're not going to go up because somebody raised a tariff or the forest burned down. So, there are all kinds of different ways that they have advantages. With something like Shellworks, and again, they're a little company. They are, a rounding error of a rounding error of that market.
Right.
But if resins keep getting too expensive or are just too hard to get, and this lends itself to sort of distributed manufacturing. I mean, there are microbes, biomass, and water everywhere.
Right.
Do we need to do it the way that we're doing it? Right. Another sort of interesting way to look at, there's another model here to look at, which is reuse. And there is a company based in Chicago that I've just been charmed by called Kadea. And it's just wild. They reinvented the bottling plant, essentially. It's not what it looks like, but that's what they did. So it looks on the outside to be like a vending machine. The bottles that you get are stainless steel. They are going after, for their initial market, closed loops. So there are OSHA requirements for water in different kinds of workplaces, construction sites, offices, whatever. And that means you have to buy the water and haul the water and store the water. Here, they're hooking up to a municipal supply and then doing a super duper filter job for the water. But you can also add bag and box, so you can be a vending machine for anything. And what makes them different is that they have a dishwasher in the back of the machine. So when you return a bottle, there's all sorts of computer, AI, whatever. It inspects it, it washes it, it goes back into things. So you don't have to haul all of those bottles from a bottling factory to that destination. And they, right now, in delivering the water with a nice profit margin, are at parity for the cost. So if you are the business owner and you don't want to deal with ordering and storing water, you can go with this right away and you're not spending any more.
Right.
So suddenly a model just sort of shifts and changes. So,
well, yeah. And I think, ultimately the point that Scott was making about predatory power, lobbying and the like, that gives way if you, just as you're getting around the bottleneck of Hormuz, you can get around the bottleneck of K Street, meaning lobbying, through just more competitive models. And that what you said about this sort of balance of just in time and just in case, as the world becomes more clearly focused on the just in case part, I remember writing about the just in time revolution 20 years ago. Efficiency was everything, and now we've seen the limit of that, both with COVID too, with the pandemic, and
it was just one definition of efficiency. So what we're seeing now are things like, water is a huge issue. So let's go to data centers for a while, because data centers are weird. They're awful in many, many ways. We don't like them. They're terrible. They're loud. They're awful. But there's also so much money pouring into them right now that they are the space race of materials right now. They have the money to throw at things. And there are two companies that are just mind-blowing. There's one called Maxwell Labs. And this is based on research that goes back maybe 30 years. So major pipeline to world changing. And they use a sort of reverse laser technology. So they're using light that they can focus on a chip to do the heat transfer. So you're not needing water and you're not needing air. Because it's light, they take that light and they are able to use, they're like miniature versions of a solar panel, but much, much more efficient. And they turn that heat into energy. And so the system of cooling can basically pay for itself.
Right.
Well, holy moly, suddenly you don't need all that. The water issue goes away and 40% of your energy bill goes away. Isn't that? There's another
innovation is a keystone here.
Oh my God. There's another company called Dexmat, and they have a material called Galvorn, which is named after an obscure Tolkien elf, because if it's not Star Trek, it's Tolkien. And it's a nanomaterial, so it is a carbon nanomaterial. So it is, kind of a disaster to initially make, but once you've got it, it's endlessly recyclable. It's stronger than steel, more flexible than aluminum, and more conductive than copper. And right now they're focused on that last one and looking at how can we use this to replace copper in electronics, since there's going to be this copper shortage. But you can also imagine, because those three materials, steel, aluminum, and copper, are what is in the grid. And we have an aging grid that's falling down, and when it's warm out, it sinks. I mean, it's just a disaster. What if you were to use this to do this? And they're actually working with cable people.
There you go. Well, Janet J. A. Ginsburg, this has been a great introduction to your research. And I really appreciate your coming on the show. We'll have to do this once in a while. I think, why not?
One thing I would like to put out there is that, you know, a lot of my research has been a little daisy chainy, where people will say, have you thought about this? Did you know about that?
Right.
And so to anybody who's watching this, if there is a company or a technology that you think should be on my radar, please reach out. Please tell me. You know, the biggest challenge in the book has been, and I've had to revamp how I'm even approaching this, is how to connect the stories, not necessarily by sector, but by insight.
Right.
So that because there are so many, can't fit them all.
And what's the common theme of how these simmering ideas turn into small experiments and then turn into something bigger? Is you finding those crossing?
Well,
whatever the dynamics that are there.
It's interesting because, you know, I'm pretty sure I'm going to lead the book off with a quote by John Greer, who was a Forbes editor and said many pithy things. And among the things he said, if it exists, it's possible. And I love that. And I thought, you know, there are a number of these companies that for one reason or another that may have nothing to do with the value of what they're doing, may not actually succeed as businesses. You know, I know of companies that literally had tens of millions of dollars clawed back, you know, by Doge. And some of the companies figured out how to pivot and they will do fine. Some of them won't. But I wanted to be able to include within a suite of stories companies that I'm pretty sure are going to make it and are going to do just fine, but also include a couple of them that they may not make it, but they showed that something was possible.
Right.
An example of this is a company. This is an Israeli startup called Naked Pack, and it was by a design student who was just annoyed by plastic waste with food. So she wanted to do like a food boil-in bag, you know, one of those bags that you just whatever, and it goes away, that would be made out of seaweed, be made out of something that wouldn't be noxious. And so you would have nothing to throw out when you were done. You know, it might be packaging that was good enough to be on the shelf, and then you throw it into boiling water and, you know, there you go. And she went to Design Week in Milan and had she's a design student, and had a little display about this. And I think it was Unilever. It was one of the big guys called her up and said, "Is this real?" And she very smartly said, "Not yet, but wait." And she managed to sort of get a prototype together, find a technical founder, do friends and family. Now I think they're working on their Series A. This is a very small little thing, but a great idea. But what really turned my head was her smarts when it came to where do you enter the business world in this. And it was camping, because when you camp, you have to take all your garbage back out with you.
Right.
What if you didn't? What if the garbage just went away when you made dinner?
Right.
Another big group that she was beginning to look at, because I don't know whether it was a grandmother, somebody pointed out to her that cruises have to take their garbage back. So what could you make that might work for a cruise on this? And so you see these wildly interesting intersections between creative business models, people who don't know that they're doing the impossible. So they have that wonderful bubble of naivete around them, and then they make it happen. And I'll give you one last one, just because they're just so sweet. And this is a company out of UW-Madison. They're called C Motive. C as in C, and then Motive. And they based their idea for a motor on something that was sketched out by Ben Franklin to make a turkey rotisserie. And I'm not kidding. I mean, like, wow. And for hundreds of years now, there'll always be a couple of graduate students who will say, oh, God, could we do that? How would you do it? It works on static electricity rather than magnetism. So it has no permanent magnet at all. It doesn't need one. What they needed to do, and the breakthrough there, was to create a fluid that would act as an insulator, I believe, so that they could control where the sparks would go between the rotors and the stators, so that they can do this. This motor, which will go into production fourth quarter of this year and then really ramp up, is for everything that you might see in an Amazon warehouse. So it's for all of those things that just, it's a conveyor belt. It's a thing with one arm. It just does whatever it does. Because its torque can be it's going to be whatever it's going to be. It's not going anywhere. It doesn't need a gearbox. It starts out 25% more energy efficient. It uses materials that are domestically supplied. And, when you think of motors, mostly you're thinking of what's in your car and, things that go rev and whatever. But most of the world's motors are these boring motors.
Right.
That are, in a warehouse.
Right.
And this makes a huge difference. So this is why, even given everything, I'm generally speaking in a pretty good mood.
That's great. and you've left me in a good mood despite the state of so many aspects of where the world is right now. And these innovators, finding a way to teach that is important. Way back, 2012, I was at Rensselaer up the Hudson River from where I used to live. And there was a course where the students had to come up with a patent, but it had to be something that could be turned into a product. This Bert Swersey, who I think has passed on now, had this course, Innovators Studio it was called, and that's where I got to know the people at Ecovative, which was growing packaging with mushrooms, and it's a company that has found its way. And what's interesting about their company? I just was poking at their website. They've expanded way beyond the initial idea, which is part of what you were saying earlier about that the person who was just poking for next steps.
So Evan Baer, who is the founder of this, he is delightful. And I first saw him present at a Pop Tech a billion years ago when he was just sort of raging against styrofoam.
Yep, that was probably what I was
and working on this. And the fact that it has grown to styrofoam replacements, to materials, to food. Right. I mean, it's wild what he's been able to do.
Yeah, it's just great. And it just shows you there's a mindset here. And there's ways to facilitate this. Hopefully the United States, despite this storm of retreat we've been seeing, can become a place where this is the norm again. I think it's still there. It's just you can facilitate, you can nurture, you can fertilize it, or you can try to stamp it down. And so thanks so much again, Janet Ginsberg.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
And everybody go on Substack. It's J.A. Ginsberg with a U. Substack.com.
like the Supreme Court justice, not the poet.
There you go. And do subscribe, and hope you subscribe to Sustain What as well. And we're going to revisit some of these great stories going forward. This will get posted on my Substack, and shortly, as soon as I can turn that around, and on we go into the future with a nice dose. I love that idea of in the morning delineating some things that make you happy, and that's a really good practice too.
Well, that, and also looking at what nature has actually figured out how to do, and
for sure,
you look at what's happened here when you talk about going forward. There is a younger generation that has been dealt such a bad hand that they have, to a certain extent, nothing to lose but to rebuild it. So that Buckminster Fuller quote about if you don't like the way it is, then build a new model.
Right.
This is what they're doing. So if I have that optimism, it really does come from looking at who's coming up and what they're capable of doing and thinking, and what they want.
Right. All right. Well, thanks again.
Thank you. Okay, you take care.
Hold on one second.
Oh, I'm so